6 seconds of silence in a room with 1,200 people is a long time, long enough for the kind of dread that an audience feels before it understands what it's actually feeling. That was the night David Phelps stopped singing, set his microphone down, and walked off the Gaither vocal band stage without an explanation, without a signal to the other members, without anything the people in those seats could hold on to. What followed in the weeks after, what his wife Shay eventually put into words, and what David himself finally confirmed after staying quiet far longer than anyone expected, revealed something about the real cost of a calling that had been quietly accumulating for years before anyone on the outside had a name for it. Stay with us, because what comes out at the 10-minute mark is the part nobody in Christian music has been willing to say out loud until now. And if you've followed David Phelps since the early homecoming days, this is the version of his story you've been waiting for. By the honest assessment of people who have actually shared a stage with him, David Phelps is the most technically gifted tenor that gospel music has produced in the last 30 years. That's not fan enthusiasm. It's the considered judgment of vocal coaches, fellow musicians, and the millions of believers who have watched his homecoming performances with something that goes well past admiration into something closer to reverence. Growing up in Texas and training at Baylor University before joining the Gaither vocal band in 1997, David brought something to that lineup that shifted its entire sound the moment he stepped in. Most tenors spend their careers reaching for the upper register and falling just short. David lived up there, and he made it sound natural, which is probably the most remarkable thing any voice can do, because nothing about singing at that level is natural at all. The performance that cemented his place in gospel music history wasn't a recording date or a television special. It was a live rendition of Jerusalem at a Gaither homecoming event that fans have shared, rewatched, and handed down to younger family members for decades. His voice climbed into a register that doesn't seem accessible to human anatomy and then held there. People in that room described the reaction not as applause, but as something closer to a collective exhale. Fans who watched it later on video have written in actual handwritten letters that something shifted in them when they heard it, that it reached a place in their faith that words alone had never been able to touch. For the millions of people who grew up with Gaither homecoming videos playing in their living rooms and in hospital rooms during the harder stretches of life, David wasn't just a performer. He was part of the language of their faith. A voice like David Phelps carries a weight that exists well below the surface of what an audience hears. Beneath the spiritual gift is a physiological reality, and that reality is not sympathetic to relentless touring schedules or to the specific physical demands of hitting notes that most tenors never attempt. Every night on the road, every performance that asked his voice to go where it had always gone, was drawing on something that doesn't replenish indefinitely and doesn't warn you before it starts to give. People close to the touring life of the Gaither vocal band during the peak years described the schedule as genuinely relentless, not as a complaint, just as the reality of what Bill Gaither had built. The demand from audiences was constant. The dates accumulated, and the travel became a kind of permanent condition. David would come home to Shay and their children, and then the road would call again and he would go, because that was the work, and the work felt like a calling. You don't put a calling on hold because you're tired. What Shay has said publicly about those years is worth paying careful attention to. She described watching her husband give everything he had to an audience every single night, leaving it all on that stage without reservation, and then arriving home empty. There's a particular loneliness in that, she said, watching someone you love pour themselves out completely for thousands of people and come through the door with nothing left to give the people who needed him most. Her words on this are quiet, but they carry more weight than most of what gets written about those years. But here's what the people filling those seats couldn't see from where they were sitting. Underneath everything else, David was managing something that, for a man whose entire identity as a musician rested on what his voice could do, was about as frightening as anything in his professional life could get. His vocal cords were showing the kind of wear that specialists don't soften when they describe it. The notes that had made him famous were becoming harder to reach, harder to sustain, and the recovery time between performances was stretching in ways that couldn't be managed much longer without something giving way. Not temporarily, permanently. The people who knew him best during those years, Guy Penrod, Mark Lowry, Bill Gaither himself, will all tell you the same thing. David never treated a performance as a professional transaction. Every song was ministry, which meant that the possibility of his voice failing him wasn't a career problem. It landed somewhere much deeper and much harder to resolve than a career problem ever could. It landed in the middle of his theology, and that's a place no specialist can write a prescription for. What David said during the period that followed that night, and what Shay confirmed separately in her own words, reframes the whole picture in a way that changes how you read everything that came before it. But to understand it, you need to know what kind of night it actually was. The Gaither vocal band had been on the road for weeks, the way they always were in those years, and the accumulation of nights and distances and performances had left almost no margin for anything to go wrong. But there are nights when careful management runs completely out of runway. This was that night. The people present at that performance described a shift in the room partway through the evening. David was singing, giving the audience everything they had come to hear, and then something changed. A number ended, and instead of returning for the next one, he wasn't there. The other members of the Gaither vocal band covered as best they could, and the audience held its breath the way a room full of believers does when something has gone wrong and the right response isn't clear yet. They knew. None of them needed to be told. They just didn't know how serious it was or how long it would be before they heard from him again. What came out in the weeks following that night wasn't a quick explanation followed by a quicker recovery. What came out reframed, for a lot of people who had followed David's ministry for years, what they thought they understood about what that ministry had actually cost him. The vocal health situation had deteriorated to a point where continuing at the pace the Gaither vocal band demanded was no longer something the specialists would recommend. The performances that had built his reputation were putting his voice at genuine risk of damage that wouldn't heal. And for a man who understood his voice as something given to him for a purpose larger than his own career, that wasn't a medical diagnosis he could simply accept and work around. That was a spiritual reckoning of a very specific and very personal kind. Around 2010, David stepped away from the Gaither vocal band. The reasons he gave publicly were genuine ones. More time with Shay and their children. More presence for the parts of family life that years on the road had quietly taken from him. Those things were true, but the whole truth included the voice and the fear of losing it for good. And the much harder question underneath all of it, what it would mean to be David Phelps without the instrument his entire ministry had been built around. What David has shared across interviews and conversations over the years is that the period following that departure was among the hardest of his life. Not because he missed the applause. He has been consistent on that point, and the consistency tells you it's true. The hard part was the silence, the absence of that specific form of service, that specific channel through which he had expressed his faith since he was a young man, was something no amount of theological preparation had actually prepared him for. Guy Penrod, who shared the Gaither vocal band stage with David through so much of that history and has known him through all of it, has spoken about this period with a quietness that says more than any detailed account would. His description of David during that stretch was of someone who had to learn, in a very real and very difficult way, to actually trust what he had always sung about. The theology that holds when things are going well is easy. The theology that holds when the voice fails and the stage goes dark, that's the theology that gets tested hard. The response from fans when word traveled through the gospel community was not the grief of an audience afraid of losing their entertainment. The letters and prayers and messages that reached David and Shay were the response of people who recognized the territory from their own lives, who understood from personal experience what it means to face the loss of something you believed you were made to do. That kind of recognition travels differently than admiration does. And then came what David eventually confirmed in his own words. The voice came back, not identical to what it had been, changed in ways that a man of his honesty acknowledges plainly when the question gets asked directly, but back. And what he brought to his music after that period, the awareness of having nearly lost it, the specific gratitude of someone who has stood at that particular edge and returned, the depth of a man who actually walked through the valley instead of just singing about it, gave his performances something that raw technical brilliance alone never could have produced. You cannot manufacture that quality. You can only come by it the hard way. When David returned to stages and to the Gaither world, people who heard him noticed something they hadn't been able to name before. Wes Hampton, who had joined the Gaither vocal band during the years of David's absence, spoke about watching David perform after his return and hearing something in the voice that none of the earlier recordings contained, a tenderness, a weight that comes specifically from having needed the grace you're singing about rather than simply singing about it well. That's not a technique anyone teaches. That's something only a particular kind of journey produces. Shay, in the few moments she has chosen to speak publicly about this chapter, put it in words that stay with you. What she watched her husband go through was hard in ways that were difficult to describe from the outside, she said. But what came out the other side was a man whose faith had been tested in the most personal way possible, and who had not let go. And that, she said, turned out to be worth more than any note he ever reached. For those who have followed David's journey through the years, through the homecoming videos playing in living rooms and in hospital rooms across this country for 3 decades, this chapter is personal in a way that doesn't require explanation. The question David was sitting with during those hard months, what remains when the thing you were given to do gets taken away, doesn't belong only to professional singers. The Gaither homecoming audience understands this territory, perhaps better than most, because the songs they've been singing their whole lives were written for exactly this kind of moment. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected, and it changes the way the whole thing reads. David's experience, the vocal crisis, the departure, the return with something changed and something deepened, follows a shape that has appeared in the lives of several artists who have defined what the Gaither world actually is. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. Michael English, who sang with the Gaither vocal band during one of its most celebrated chapters, walked away from gospel music under circumstances that were far more public and far more painful than David's. But what Michael has spoken about in the years since, the long road back, The restoration he describes in specifically theological terms, the return to a stage he wasn't certain would receive him again, carries the same essential shape as what David went through. Loss, then silence, then something that looks, by any honest accounting, like grace doing what grace does. Russ Taff, whose voice has been among the most recognized in Christian music history for decades, has been similarly open about the years when addiction and personal struggle pulled him away from the ministry he spent his life building. The way the gospel community received his return tells you something important about what this audience actually believes when it sings the songs it loves. Bill Gaither has been present for more of these difficult chapters than almost anyone else in gospel music. What he has said across many years and many conversations is that the homecoming family was never assembled because everyone in it had things figured out. It was assembled because they all needed what they were singing about. David's chapter fits that tradition exactly. The Gaither homecoming tradition has not endured, despite the difficult chapters in its artists' lives. In some real and important way, it has endured because of them. An audience of genuine faith doesn't just want beautiful, they want true. And David Phelps, after everything that followed the night he walked off that stage, is both. What happens next for David Phelps is something the gospel community will keep watching. Whatever comes next, the fans who have followed this ministry for decades know something that doesn't require a full accounting to confirm. David Phelps' story isn't finished. The man who walked off that stage, who lived through the silence and the fear and the long road back, came out the other side, still singing, still meaning it, still capable of making a room full of people feel something that moves past the music and settles somewhere deeper and more lasting. For those who have been with him from the beginning, that's reason enough to keep watching. If this story connected with you, the next video will as well. We've been covering the untold chapters behind some of the most beloved voices in the Gaither world, and what has come out of that work is just as unexpected and just as worth your time.